I kicked off my real estate career in Virginia Beach about 15 years ago. If you know anything about Virginia and the Carolinas, is that they're prone to hurricanes. I was living in Virginia Beach when the biggest hurricane at that time, Hurricane Isabel, hit back in 2003, caused about $1.6 billion in damage. More recently, in 2017, Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma, they devastated Texas, Louisiana, and Florida all in a 2-month period and did about 175 billion in damage. In 2018, Hurricane Florence did almost $19 billion in damage in the Carolinas. So, the economic losses caused by these hurricanes are no joke. As real estate investors, we must consider the possibility of flood damage in certain regions where we buy properties. A property located in a flood zone doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't buy it. However, you need to do deeper due diligence. So if a flood or a hurricane hit, you're prepared and the investment isn't negatively impacted. So you can purchase insurance located in these high-risk flood zones, and in some cases, it's required by federal law to have insurance. There are maps online that show you where the flood zones are in each area, and I'll include a link in the description so you can check that out. But with these super hurricanes like Katrina, many neighborhoods weren't even considered to be in flood zones. And since it wasn't required, people didn't buy any. After that hurricane hit, many families were hit with not only that financial burden of losing their home, but also putting their lives back together. And according to FEMA, over 20% of all these flood insurance claims come from areas outside of designated flood zones. So if you have an investment property on the border of a flood zone or an area that's of a state that's prone to these hurricanes, you still want to consider getting flood insurance for your asset. There are many resources online, as I mentioned earlier, that will give you an idea as to where those flood zones are. But again, if you're not sure, ask your agent and see what they know about the coverage in those certain areas. But when you compare the potential loss in order to the premium, it's very inexpensive. And over the past 10 years, the average flood claim has been about $46,000, with annual totals averaging about 3.5 billion a year. If you consider the damages done to a large multifamily deal, this figure will certainly be much larger. For residential people out there, a flood policy may run about $600 a year for a small residential building. Among all the natural disasters, I choose to talk about flooding in this video because according to FEMA, approximately 90% of all these disaster-related property damage is from flooding. So as for considerations you need to take into account when you're buying insurance, again, you need to determine if the property is in a flood zone during the underwriting process and get that cost in before you buy the deal. Also make sure you're clear on the coverage and the limits of that flood policy. So depending on the size of the deal and your investment targets, the cost of the insurance may eat up a larger portion of your expenses that you didn't expect. So that due diligence is super important. It's also worth noting that flood insurance is not covered in your basic policy. And if that property is in a high-risk flood zone, you'll be required to have insurance by the lender before you can close. And again, if you're operating in a place that's prone to hurricanes and adverse weather conditions, know that you're getting into that deal in your due diligence phase. That's ultimately what you have to do. If the property is in a moderate or low risk flood zone or even on the border, get a quote for insurance. I personally would build it into my expenses and buy it. Having personally experienced a hurricane and some of the properties that I've had that have been exposed to it, I've been fortunate enough to have that type of insurance that covered over 100K of one of my smaller properties and damages that I experienced. So not to mention too, it also covered loss of rents as it was uninhabitable while they were doing all the repairs. So it was certainly well worth the investment I've made over the years. As real estate entrepreneurs, we need to take the time to plan. The way you do your underwriting and you perform your due diligence, you line up the financing, insurance needs to be closely considered. Take the time to figure out how much insurance you need. Err on the side of caution when you're doing your premium and make sure that you understand that what those costs are and the coverage limits are there. Have you guys been hit with a flood? How'd you guys handle it? Please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. Also, check out our podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, and subscribe to the new YouTube channel as well. All these videos are up there along with the podcast recordings as well. We're working on getting new content out every day to really help you build success in the world of multifamily. Anyway, be great, guys. Talk to you soon.